Three Houses is a very refined game. It implements many of its ideas and mechanics quite well. For example, it borrows weapon arts and spell lists from Valencia, but does much more with the systems, with larger quantity of each and a decent amount of diversity between them. However, while its ideas are well implemented, that says nothing about the quality of the ideas themselves, and that's where I think Three Houses, and modern Fire Emblem in general, can sometimes falter. Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War, is one of the most mechanically unique Fire Emblem games. It has great ideas, though the implementation can sometimes falter. What that means is it should be the perfect place to borrow ideas from, but the series seems to only ever take things from FE4 at a surface level. Three Houses itself takes quite a bit from FE4. There's some names, major and minor crests imitate major and minor holy blood, easily repairable weapons, and a distinct two halves are just some. There are fewer truly substantial similarities, however, at least in the sense of things that haven't become Fire Emblem staples like skills. One thing that is uniquely similar between the two, however, is that in both games you spend a decent chunk of time outside of battle. In Three Houses, this is the monastery. In FE4, this is the home castle. They both give the player more opportunity to manage their characters and improve them outside of the main combat of the game. Though, I think the way FE4 does this is significantly more interesting and better. Both give you the opportunity to train your characters, in Three Houses through tutoring, and FE4 through the arena. But the latter ends up being much more interesting due to the fact that it does so through the combat system. Not only do different characters perform differently in the arena, but interacting with the system becomes an exercise that's easier the better you are at the main game. If you're good at setting up miracles in the field, you can use that knowledge to get a character through the arena. If you're good at managing money and items, you can optimize ring usage that more people get Paragon, or stat rings and weapons which allow them to defeat more opponents. In tutoring, you click the button for the skill you want to train, and then how effective it is random. There's a choice in what skill you train, but it's a rather uninvolved system. On top of that, the arena is far more integrated into the loop of the game. In both games, experience gained through tutoring or the arena makes units more effective in combat on the battlefield. Good item management also affects this, and you can acquire more items and funds through gameplay. For Three Houses, though, this is where it ends. But because of the nature of the arena being combat, training gained from regular gameplay as well as item management both affect the arena. Alongside that, since you gain money in addition to experience in it, it affects item management. Not only is it thus a more core part of the gameplay loop, it's also simpler to understand since it's an extension of the main parts of the game. And that's for those who want to use these systems. For those who find them tedious and think they're a waste of time, the castle is again far superior. You can ignore it the whole game and it won't ever bother you. The monastery jumps in your face between each story mission and you have to actively skip it. The castle is optional. The monastery is skippable, which is an important distinction. Both of them can overstay their welcome sometimes. The arena because it can drag on a bit, the monastery because of dull concepts. As such, even though it can be a little much, I enjoy my time with the arena much more than with the monastery. Fire Emblem games have some trouble with difficulty. For the most recent games in particular, I think it's a common feeling that hard is a drastic overstatement, and insane and maddening are far too well titled. It's hard to blame the games too much for this though, at least maddening feels distinct from the others. There's a rather large flaw with difficulty modes in that they're a bad solution to what they're trying to accomplish, that being modular difficulty. You've probably seen skill curves used before to show the input of a player's skill and the output of power in a game, but these are mostly used for PvP games because they complement them well. When used to show a single-player game, an inherent issue shows up. What does power actually achieve? In multiplayer games, it's really easy to answer this. If you face someone, the person with the higher power is more likely to win, with a greater likelihood depending on how much higher. As such, to balance the game, you simply need to pair players with similar power levels, resulting in a relatively standardized difficulty experience for those of any skill level. In single-player games, elegant dynamic difficulty in this manner is much harder to design. Instead, power is used to get over generally static hurdles, meaning higher skill level players may face no challenge, and lower skill level players might find certain things impossible. Each challenge is a horizontal line on the skill curve, which, assuming the player desires a surmountable challenge, is only satisfying to those close to its level and power. Difficulty modes are a band-aid solution to this issue since they merely add more levels which the player can be compared to, increasing the range of players which will be satisfied from the difficulty, but in the most hard-coded way possible. And that's ignoring the fact that what a game defines as easy and hard are variable and unclear to first-time players. There are already better examples of ways to solve this difficulty problem within the series. One problem with the single-player skill curve is that there isn't usually much incentive for moving past that difficulty line, so the best way to satisfy players of high skill is to give them that. FE4 isn't the only Fire Emblem game to include rankings, but it was the first, and I think they're a feature that should be in every game in the series. Essentially, they're a much smoother method of implementing difficulty modes in a way that gives the player a lot of freedom. Rather than choosing a difficulty at the beginning of the game, which may end up with them picking one poorly suited for them, rankings encourage players to play in ways that are more challenging. They can not only pick and choose which ones they attempt, but also what they consider a pass and a fail. Some players might strive only for the highest rank, while others may be satisfied with A's and B's. The player is then custom making a difficulty mode which they can modify and change however they like. It's a simple matter of turning extrinsic goals into semi-intrinsic ones. With this in place, the actual difficulty of the game can be lowered, allowing lower skill players to be challenged by the base game and higher level players to challenge themselves with rankings. And this is exactly what FE4 does. It's one of the easiest games in the Fire Emblem series, mainly because it's so forgiving with being able to save every turn, and thus requires little skill to beat. But beating it at the highest ranking does require some talent. It could use some tuning, but the system is excellent. Even more elegant than this, though, is something like the Miracle skill, which is one of, I think, the best mechanics in all of Fire Emblem. When a character who has the skill takes damage and ends up with less than 11 health, they get 10 avoid for each HP below 11 they're at, until the start of your next turn. If they say end up with 4 HP, that's a whopping 70% avoid they receive, making them basically unhittable. The downside to all of this is that it's not so simple to set up. It may go off on accident, in which case it will cleverly look as if the character miraculously dodged many attacks, but for those who want to make full use of it, proper planning and math is required, along with a little bit of risk. The reward for this is a basically immortal character for a turn, allowing a single unit to face an overwhelming number of enemies. It's a skill that low-skill players will ignore, but high-skill players can abuse to speed up play, and is yet another way a high-skill player can challenge themselves and be rewarded. It's really unfortunate that ever since FE4, Miracle's become an awful luck-based save from death chance, mostly stuck on clerics that shouldn't be fighting anyways. Rather than killing it, it should have been learned from so that more mechanics like it could be added. When thinking of difficulty in Fire Emblem, FE4 isn't often looked at because it's considered rather easy. But nonetheless, I believe it has a lot to offer regarding the subject. From branching classes, to full class switching, to skill building, to 3 houses where you completely build student characters from the ground up, the amount of customization the player has over the characters has been increasing in the Fire Emblem series. However, if this is the path the series is heading down, I think FE4 presents some good options beyond just surface level things. Trading is a great mechanic, which opens up a number of techniques and strategies in the games it's in. However, not having it can be interesting as well. Since getting items between characters is a gold cost in FE4, deciding who gets what becomes much more meaningful. Suddenly you have to plan ahead for a given situation with your loadouts, or coordinate selling an item off on one character mid-chapter so you can buy it somewhere else. So there's still some interesting strategy to be had, but it has another advantage in the form of character customization. The items you give to characters will be what they use in combat for quite a while, and no other character will be able to use them. Thus items become much more personalized. The solid variety of weapons and items also makes it so that there's multiple ways to build most characters. The Christmas cows, for example, have a decent few good ways to fix their main issues, and despite being the same class, these differ from each other. There's only so many items to go around, so you have to choose which characters get the good ones and thus become more effective. Is there a character you like, but they're not as effective as you want them to be? There's probably some items to fix that. You don't see this in other games because a single weapon can be passed between multiple characters in a single turn. Item choice loses any customization elements and becomes solely about strategy. Of course, when talking about character customization in FE4, there's a much more prominent aspect to look at. With this trend that Fire Emblem is following of more and more customization, the core of it seems to be around choosing classes for characters. The problem with designing customization around class choice is that class has a massive impact on how a character plays, and quickly overshadows individual aspects of the character. This is mostly due to the fact that classes are never balanced in comparison to each other. Rather than looking at what characters have unique synergies with specific classes, this usually resolves in the thought process of, Can this character get into and do well in the strongest classes of this game? If so, put them in one of those classes. This is something you can see as far back as Sacred Stones, with most branching classes having one better choice. But it reached its peak in the environment of Three Houses, where skill levels put a focus on the unengaging task of getting a character into a class, rather than actually using them in it. Characters thus have a huge variance in how they perform, almost entirely based on what class you give them. And because of this, it can kind of feel like rather than customizing characters, you're customizing classes, which causes characters to lose their identity. Next to that, the elements which differentiate characters of the same class are somewhat minimal. In Three Houses, there's not really a significant difference between the melee weapon types, the black magic spell list is disappointingly uniform and dull, personal skills quickly fall off in usefulness, and crests are almost completely ignorable. The children in FE4, in contrast, are designed in the other direction. They have set classes and roles, which you can then manipulate depending on the choice of father. This means they have meaningful personal attributes, but still have a customizable performance. And in regards to that performance, when you have skills with as much impact as allowing a unit the ability to double and critical, the difference between just a couple skills can be great. I mentioned earlier that Noish and Alec have different needs despite being the same class, and that's almost entirely because of their difference in skills. Not only then do you get to choose how to build the children, but also what their issues and weaknesses are in the first place. The result of all this is that despite classes being locked in, and arguably the most unbalanced in the series, you have a great deal of meaningful and interesting control over the characters in FE4. The point of all this isn't to say FE4 is amazing and Three Houses sucks, because Three Houses is pretty great, and FE4 has many flaws. But nonetheless, FE4 is still my favorite Fire Emblem game. As I've said, FE4's strongest aspects are its ideas, a lot of which are unique to it, and many of these give the game strengths where modern Fire Emblem has flaws. Unfortunately, most inspiration taken from FE4 nowadays is surface level, or story-wise, instead of the far more unique mechanical aspects. Awakening takes the story relevance of pairing up characters and adds quite a lot to it, but really undercuts the mechanically interesting parts of Children. To some extent, this proves that FE4's ideas have a lot of potential, but it also shows the unwillingness to try them. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but I hope for the day when FE4 isn't my favorite Fire Emblem game. Maybe then I'll be able to stop thinking about it.